Welcome everyone to the Enhancing Security through MidPoint and SIEM Integration webinar led by Evolveum's partner Atricore. Atricore's holistic approach adds technical expertise to open source solutions, providing enterprise-grade cybersecurity for organizations of all sizes. They're located in the US and Brazil, and they can deliver services in the US and also across Latin America. Our speakers today are Sebastián. He is a co-founder at Atricore, and he now serves as the Chief Technology Officer, and he's also the system architect and the developer behind Joso. Another speaker, Gianluca, is a co-founder and the CEO at Atricore, and he has made substantial contributions to the open source community through pivotal projects such as Joso, Atricore.io, and Quash. Let me also welcome Gerardo. He's an IT security engineer from Wazuh, a company behind an open source security information and event management system with the same name. And Gerardo specializes in pre-sales engineering, solutions architecture, and cybersecurity design. During this webinar, the speakers will explore the robust integration between MidPoint and Wazuh. So I would like to give the word to the speakers to get us started. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
So I'm Sebastián, as Ana said. The idea of today's presentation, as Ana said, is to explore the integrations between both Wazuh and MidPoint. Let's take a look at today's agenda. We'll start with Gianluca. He will be talking about the new challenges in security today, right? Zero trust, identity is a new perimeter. These are like paradigm changes that we are experiencing today when we configure security environments. Then we will have a Wazuh introduction, take a look at the product. I know you are mostly familiar with the Evolveum MidPoint, right? You probably know about MidPoint, AGI, IDM, and what MidPoint can do. So we'll be getting into a little detail on what Wazuh can do. And then we'll go through the benefits of integrating both MidPoint and Wazuh. And the rest of the agenda is about details on how can we achieve these integrations, right? How can we install them together? How can we get some sort of configuration going on? And what are the aspects that we'll be addressing with this integration, right? There are a few things we can do with Wazuh and MidPoint we'll discover during the presentation. So, and at the end, we'll have some question and answers. We'll have some practical activities, so we can take a look at this actually running, and all the resources we'll be using in this demonstration will be available to you as well. So let me get you Gianluca. He will be starting with the identity in his new perimeter.
Thank you, Sebastián. Okay. So basically, before getting into the, let's say, the specific integration details between SIEM and IGA, I wanted to kind of introduce the why, the rationale behind this, right? And the current, if you want, landscape in terms of if you want security. So during the past, I would say at least decade, we started shifting from endpoint security to identity-centric security. Okay, so instead of relying on network addresses and IP-based information to do access control, we basically rely on the identity. And the idea is that you verify the identity, because we cannot basically rely on network-based information, because the user can be anywhere. Okay, they can be connecting from a Starbucks, they can be connecting from their home. So now somehow the security, the access control is, if you think, it's fluid and it's based on identity. And this has been a shift that has also, let's say, the core idea is zero trust architecture. So that's basically hand in hand, and and created this new concept, which is basically the identity is now the new perimeter. So within this presentation, so we're going to explore what are the synergies between SIEM and IGA. Okay, so the main both solutions are not there is some overlap, however they complement each other. So let's start with you can see in the diagram that the SIEM is focused more on real-time security threat detection, and IGA instead is more, let's say, policy driven. So somehow the SIEM is meant for designed for detecting threats as fast as possible and mitigate those threats with some response action, and the IGA, it's policy driven. It's basically operating behind the scenes and making sure that the identities are aligned with the corporate policies. So they have different objectives, if you want, but they can actually there's a lot of synergy going on, potential synergy, and that's what we are going to explore. In terms of the one of the challenges with identity, when the identity becomes, let's say, the central component of your security architecture, is that you have to protect it. So so you need something, that some software, some solution that can protect also the your IGA solution, which become the, let's say, has the keys to the kingdom. So the SIEM is a core component of any security operations center, so that the SIEM will be basically be protecting or adding additional security to the IGA solution. In terms of the visibility, you will get different type of you will have different type of information. The SIEM will be focused on threats, on addressing those threats, on providing information that it's meant to detect threats and address those threats, while the IGA will be focused on the identity management side of things. So by integrating the IGA piece within a security operations center, the additional, let's say, information about identities will be basically accessible from the SIEM. So the SIEM will be able to make, let's say, better decisions, and will have additional context when making decisions, such as, let's say, a response action. And additionally, it will be able to respond with actions that are related with identity. So it can, for instance, deprovision an identity if there is some let's say, anomaly in terms of the user behavior. It can say, no, this user, this account has to be disabled, or this account will be, maybe some rights will be removed from that account. So we're going to explore here in terms of the specific products. SIEM solution will be Wazuh, and in terms of IGA, the solution will be MidPoint. So we're going to explore with everyone here the specific, let's say, a specific use case with these solutions.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we have an idea of what we're going to do and the challenges of this integration. And let's take a look at Wazuh in a little detail, right?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gerardo Caceres. You can call me Gerard. And well, I'm part of the pre-sales team here at Wazuh. And in today's session, I'd like to briefly introduce you the Wazuh architecture, okay? And I want to give you an idea of the different key features that this platform offers, okay? For example, its openness to iterations and flexibility to be tailored to fit any specific need, okay? What we can see here is basically the architecture of the Wazuh solution. But what is Wazuh? Wazuh is a highly scalable and customizable SIEM and XDR solution, okay? It is completely open source, which means that you don't need a license, or you don't need to pay a license to install or use it, okay? The solution is developed by the company with the same name, and even though it is open source, there are people working exclusively on improving and supporting the solution, okay? And I also like to mention that Wazuh is trusted by some of the largest companies in the world, such as, I don't know, Visa, eBay, Salesforce, etc. And it is also worth mentioning that we have the biggest cybersecurity community in the open source world, okay? And we are very, very proud about it. So, well, talking about the architecture is divided into 4 fundamental parts for the systems operation. And this diagram represents a standard type of deployment. We can see the entire process, starting with collecting logs from different sources, generating security alerts with the analysis engine, and searching for information with the dashboard, okay, with the UI. And on one hand, we have the agents, okay, on the left side, we have the agents that run on the monitor endpoints and send security data to the central server, to the Wazuh manager. And this agent is a very lightweight software that can be installed on various operating systems, including Linux, Windows, Mac OS, Oracle Solaris, HP UX, etc. Okay? And the agent includes various capabilities, various features, such as log collection from the OS and applications, vulnerability detection, file integrity monitoring, and XDR actions. Regarding application monitoring, databases, web services, and antiviruses are usually common use cases, okay? And it means that we can monitor basically both aspects of the endpoint, okay? The OS information, the OS insight, and also the applications that are running in there, okay? Well, that's the Wazuh agent. I can also tell you that network devices are also supported, but through the agentless approach. And this means that we can monitor firewalls, switches, access points, etc. And the approach that we will need to follow is syslog, because syslog is a standard for logs management, and the Wazuh manager can receive the syslog data directly without using an agent, okay? I just wanted to add something additional here. The data is going to be collected by the Wazuh server, and the Wazuh server is going to process the information, basically, okay? And we can also receive data from different type of services, not just, let's say, operating systems and network devices, but also cloud service providers and applications. So we can use the Wazuh API in order to receive data from these different sources. For example, AWS, Azure, Office 365, and GCP. So we are going to monitor sources such as Entra ID, Exchange, CloudTrail, S3 buckets, etc. Okay. So again, this data is going to be received by the Wazuh server, which is the platform's brain, and this data is going to be processed. So basically, the data is going to be split in multiple fields, and then these fields or this data is going to be correlated with security rules or security conditions, okay? And we do have more than 4,500 security rules included by default. But I think that one of the great things about Wazuh is the flexibility again. So it means that we can support new sources, or it means that we can create new parsers and import new ones as well, okay? That's something very, very cool. After the generation of the alerts, the data is going to be stored within the indexer, which is the very powerful search engine that we can use to organize the information. And also here we can define the retention policies according to our own needs. For example, a industry standard is usually 90 days for hot storage, okay, searchable data, and 1 year for archiving or cold storage, okay? The last component, the dashboard again, the UI is very intuitive, and there are several panels that are included by default, but still we can create new panels, new dashboards according to what is most important for us. So we can create a centralized dashboard with all the different aspects that are most relevant for our company, for our business model, applications, and so on. For example, we could create a dashboard that is going to present information related to Active Directory events, the latest database queries, and why not, the authentication attempt with the geolocation parameters, for example, okay? So yes, this is essentially the Wazuh architecture. Okay, and I also wanted to explain in more detail how Wazuh's data flow works, okay? Here we can see the same 4 main components as before, and the different states of the data, which basically go from the left to the right, okay? And the first thing here is the event, okay? The event, the raw data, the original log. This is the information that the Wazuh manager receives from different sources, okay, such as laptops, servers, applications, etc. And it could receive this information in multiple ways, such as syslog, API, a Wazuh agent, log file, custom scripts, etc. It is very, very flexible, okay? These events will be processed by the analysis engine, which will split the data in multiple fields. And as we mentioned, it is going to correlate this with the massive list of security rules, okay? And you will also find that there are various of these security rules that are shared by the community itself, okay? That's something very, very important. And well, after this, the alerts are going to be sent to the indexer, okay? The search engine that is going to create the indices, and that is going to split the different, that is going to split the data depending of the index patterns that we want to use. For example, I could create an index pattern for network devices, so I can keep the data in a different state for network devices. Let's say 90 days for the routers, and maybe 1 year for the databases events, and I don't know, 180 days for events related to Active Directory, okay? It is very, very flexible as well. What else? Yes, we can also use the indexer in order to define the different, let's say, states of the data, but not just the states, but also the location or where we want to store this information, okay, for the long-term storage. For example, an external HDD drive, an external directory, or maybe we want to send the information directly to S3 buckets, okay? That's also supported. I think that's it from my end. This is essentially an overview of how it works, and I will be glad to answer any of your questions, okay? So I would like to let Sebastián to take the lead again.
Thank you, Gerard. That was nice. So I guess that we have a slightly better idea of what Wazuh can do. So what are the benefits of integrating MidPoint and Wazuh, right? MidPoint manages sensitive information. You know that you manage all the identity information from your company, your organizations. We know that that's critical. As Gianluca mentioned, the identity is a new perimeter. So keeping this safe is critical. So one of the things we can ensure with Wazuh is that the system is properly configured, right? One of the modules that you have in Wazuh, and we're going to take a look at more detail on what we can do, right? We discussed in the top broad level of what we can do. But one of the things we can do with Wazuh is what it's called security configuration assessment. And this is a component that allows you to basically identify if your system is properly configured. But not only MidPoint, we can check that the operating system or the environment where MidPoint is running is properly configured. So we can ensure that the files that have the proper permissions, we have the proper packages installed, we don't have old things or packages, or maybe packages with vulnerabilities. So we can use the security configuration assessment for that. We can also monitor system integrity, right? There is another component in Wazuh that allows you to identify if something changes, something has been updated. So we check the integrity of the system. But this is more about how MidPoint is running and if configured and secured. But we can also use Wazuh to identify suspicious activity inside MidPoint, of course, and outside. Let's say we can use MidPoint auditing module to get activity information in Wazuh, and then we can analyze that activity, right? We can ingest that activity as a log, like Gerard mentioned, and then we can structure that log. We can get the details of the log from MidPoint and create rules and threat detection rules for those events, right? And then you can work with the threat mitigation, right? One thing we will see is that whenever you find a threat, you probably need to take action. The security team will have to take action based on that. And sometimes that action may be disabling an account or reducing its privileges. We can use Wazuh to talk to MidPoint so that MidPoint knows precisely how to do that, right? That's one of the key aspects of MidPoint. It's basically the bread and butter is managing identity information across multiple systems. So if you want to change a user privilege, maybe that has an impact in multiple systems, and MidPoint is very good for that. But then Wazuh knows when to do that in case of security-related changes, and we can integrate them both. MidPoint has an API that can be used to automatically make trigger activities, changes, stuff like that, right? So integrating both is very good because we improve MidPoint security, right? But we also improve how the security team reacts to threats by integrating both solutions. So how does the integration work? Gerard mentioned we have Wazuh has this agent component, right? And agents are running on endpoints. Endpoints are servers, workstations, a router, right? You have many devices. Some endpoints are agentless, but in case of MidPoint, we are running on an operating system or an environment server, so we can run a Wazuh agent in there. And this can be run not only in a standalone or traditional on-premise server. You can deploy this in a container, even in Kubernetes. We will see some examples today, and everything we are showing you is running on a Kubernetes cluster. So it's very flexible. There's the deployment options that you have for this. But what we'll have is a Wazuh agent running alongside MidPoint. The Wazuh agent can use the MidPoint API to take action eventually, but it can analyze the audit logs that MidPoint generates using the auditing module. And it can also analyze the environment where MidPoint is running, right? It can check the OS, it can check MidPoint itself. So that is how we integrate. In case of the MidPoint API, we'll see we have a special user for that, but in case of Wazuh, the integrations can be used, can use any, since this is an API, Wazuh supports creating your client basically in multiple technologies, Python, script, Java, whatever works for you, right? So it's very flexible in that regard. So let's start by configuring MidPoint, right? The first thing we need to do, we're going to start pushing information from MidPoint to Wazuh. The idea is that MidPoint has an audit module that we can enable, right? And that will basically generate a log with all the activity that is occurring on MidPoint. I know MidPoint supports also sending audit events to a database, but in this case, we're using the file because it's easier to integrate with Wazuh. So if we look at, for instance, MidPoint configuration, right? This is our MidPoint environment, right? We're running Kubernetes. Let's take a look at the system configuration for MidPoint. If we go to the login settings, you will see that there is an audit section that it's enabled, right? We have changed this. By default, this is disabled, but you can enable. And all you have to provide is an appender name where the events are going to be logged. So what we have defined also is a new appender, right, in MidPoint. And the appender basically has a very simple pattern. This is how the message in the log file will be generated. You can add more. If you look at the appenders that MidPoint has out of the box are more complex patterns. We just need the message information because it contains all what we need to integrate this event in Wazuh. We define the log, the name, the file name, and the rotation strategy. In this case, we don't have a large rotation or retention strategy because we are pushing all the messages through the agent to the Wazuh server. So that's where we're keeping logs, right? Gerard mentioned the log retention policy. You can configure that. So we don't need to keep a large log configuration on the MidPoint side. But with this enabled, what MidPoint will do basically, we can access the server. This is my Kubernetes dashboard by terminal console. So I'm accessing the MidPoint server. And in the var logs folder, we have a MidPoint audit log file, right, that we're generating. This is what you'll see. The only thing we have is that we have this, the pattern creates this MP audit text before the lines. We'll see that's helpful when we go through the Wazuh configuration for this. But this is basically how you enable the login module in MidPoint. And with that, we have already a log that the Wazuh agent can use, can consume, can ingest. The other thing we have is the MidPoint API. For that, we created a user. We'll see that this is, let me show, we have a small set of users, but we have created an API client user. This is the user that the Wazuh server will use when making changes in MidPoint. We'll see when we get that, but the idea is that you create a separate user so you can keep track of this activity, right? And the integrations, as I mentioned, are done through scripts. In case of Wazuh, we created a simple Python script. We'll show you that later when we take a look at that case. But the idea is that you can use any development language pretty much, because what Wazuh will do is run a process that you have on the Wazuh server installed. So you can choose the technology. You can use a Java MidPoint client if you're familiar with that, right? So this is how we configure MidPoint, and the Wazuh agent already, it's a little more complex. So let's take a look at the Wazuh configuration. For Wazuh, we have several artifacts we can use. One is the policies, right? Policies define, again, what we want to check on the environment. The policies define, for instance, which files are critical that you need to monitor that are not to be changed, or what are the settings you need in your environment. You need the configuration file for MidPoint to be read-only by the user, for instance. That's a really very common use case because you have a database password sometimes in there, and you want to make sure that nobody can read that one. Then you have the decoders and rules. These are configuration options that tells Wazuh how to interpret a MidPoint audit message, for instance. So you have we saw the MidPoint log has a lot of data. I didn't get into details there, but we'll see. And then, so you need to tell Wazuh how to read that, how to interpret that log, because Wazuh MidPoint will give you information about the target object that's being changed, things like that. When we want to monitor MidPoint activity, we'll need a decoder. And then we have rules. The rules are, once we have that structure, we have that event in Wazuh, what we need to look for. And so you can say, for instance, some rules about a specific user type changing. That might be a rule that triggers an alert, right? In Wazuh, the alerts are like signals that something might be happening, and we'll take a look at that, an example for that. And then we have the integrations that are the way of how to configure in Wazuh when to trigger an integration automatically. So, for instance, you say if a specific rule is triggered, let's run an integration. You can say if somebody fails a login 3 times, let's run the MidPoint integration and disable that account, right? And we'll see that example. And the other thing that's interesting in Wazuh is that you have groups where you can configure these things, these settings. So you will see that you can group your endpoints, and then you can have specific configurations for those groups. In this case, you have a group that is a MidPoint group, which is good because we have all the MidPoint specific configuration associated with that group. So every time we run a MidPoint endpoint or a server, the server will have a Wazuh agent that is basically representing that endpoint, and that endpoint will be part of the MidPoint group, and all the configuration policies and rules will apply to that new server. So that's very good. So let's start with the first example, right? Threat hunting is called in Wazuh. This is basically Wazuh will analyze real-time alerts and activity logs, right? And it will decode those events, and it will be process those events as part of the rules that we have, and then we can use that to analyze suspicious activities. So what we would mean with this, right? Because so far we'll be talking about these events, alerts, a little abstract. So let's go to Wazuh, right? This is the dashboard, and we have one of the sections we have is the events, right? events can provide information about activity. And you can see that we have one agent, MidPoint 1. This is the agent name, the endpoint. This is where we're running our MidPoint server with our Wazuh agent. And you can see there are activities related to that endpoint, right? For instance, we have one example is MidPoint user type action modify object. This means that a user was modified in MidPoint. We have a way of analyzing that a user was modified in MidPoint. This is coming from the MidPoint audit module, right? And if we get to the details, you can get all the information that MidPoint generated about this event. But how does Wazuh knows that we have the, for instance, the initiator object ID? This is the administrator user, basically, or the initiator type. It was a user that triggered this, right? Or the outcome. How can we get that? Well, for that, in Wazuh, we have what I told you, that these decoders. So if you go to the configuration and go to decoders, right? Wazuh has over 1,500,000 decoders, but you can create your custom ones. So we've defined MidPoint decoders, right? MidPoint specific decoders that we have configured. And the way you define a decoder in Wazuh, it uses XML. If you're familiar with MidPoint configuration, you're probably familiar with XML because we use that a lot as well. And how this does is basically Wazuh will get any log entry from any agent and will process that entry through all the decoders that it has, right? The way Wazuh has to identify a specific decoder is by rules of and matching that with a specific decoder. The decoders uses regular expressions heavily. So we have a decoder named MidPoint, and the rule to match a line is that it starts with MP audit. That's why we added that on the MidPoint configuration, right? It's easy to map here, quickly mapping on the Wazuh side. So if the log line starts with this, we say this is a MidPoint decoder. And then we have other decoders that are dependent of the one we created that will run regular expressions to start extracting information from that audit event, right? If you know MidPoint audit module, you know that the event has information about, for instance, the outcome. It's part of the log, right? We have the channel, the principal, we have the target object, we have the message. Yes, all this information is part of the log. For instance, in Wazuh, you have running a test tool to test. You can paste a log entry that you're working with. I just copied this before with the MidPoint audit log. If I test this, we can see how the decoder is processing this log entry, right? And we can see that there is an initial phase where it's getting all this information, right? This is the structuring part that the decoder is doing. Then it will be matching this with rules, right? This is like the next step. But the first one is you have this decoder that allows you to extract and structure information from the log and map that to values. The idea is that you have a regular expression. That expression have some settings that will match. Remember, in a regular expression, whenever you use a parenthesis, that will extract that value, any variable, and then Wazuh will map these values with these variable names, and it will use those names to create the alert, right? So that's how we extract information from the decoder. The next step is basically how do we know that that information is malicious or not? It is potential threat, and for that we have the rules in Wazuh, right? So if we go to the rules configuration, again, as Gerard said, Wazuh comes with thousands of rules out of the box, but you can create your own rules. And we have MidPoint specific rules. The decoder is more like you can reuse that decoder in any environment. The rules are more organization specific. One thing we'll see is that how to map those rules with compliance standards. But what the rule is doing is, okay, let's analyze this log entry. Based on the rule information, we can say that if particular data is present or has a particular value, the rule will trigger and that will raise an alert, right? So far, the decoder creates an event. With the rule, you transform that event into an alert, and the alert will have a level, right? The level goes from 1 to 15. 15s are critical, the most critical alerts in Wazuh. 1 or 0 is a trivial activity, right? You still keep low level alerts because you want to keep a log of the activity. Maybe in the future you're investigating some security issue, and even though the activity is not malicious by itself, it's part of a broader investigation, and you can get data from that. So that's a good practice, right? You get all the activity, and then you'll see if you use it somewhere. But some rules are critical. For instance, we have a rule that says that an archetype was changed, right, in MidPoint. Maybe you want to know if somebody's changing your archetypes, because your archetypes in MidPoint, you know, these are critical objects. These affect how things are created. Maybe you have some business critical groups in MidPoint that you don't want to change, or if they change, you want to be notified. Maybe that's an issue, something you need to investigate. So you can create rules for that. If you take a look at how the rules are configured, again, we use XML. And how it works is the rule says if the message was decoded as MidPoint, this rule will match. Automatically, you have this rule ID we created. It's a level 4. Normally, this will be 0, so you don't see it in the dashboard, but we set it to 4 because we wanted to show you some things. Wazuh will not show alerts level 3 and below, I guess, or level 0. But we have a rule. It says this is an alert level 4. This is a MidPoint message. That's all it says. But then you have other rules that say if you match the previous rule and the event type is create session, oh, this is a MidPoint authentication, right? So Wazuh will automatically trigger a rule level 5 for you. That's 901, right? Instead of the previous one, right? Wazuh will trigger the alert that matches with the most level of detail. So this will override the previous one. But then you have another rule that says if you match the previous one, this is a create session, but the outcome is not success. This is an authentication failure, right? And you can configure some groups. This will add to the authentication fail index in the Wazuh dashboard. We'll see when you go to the dashboard, there is a number of authentication fails. But then you can refer to some specific policy standard that you want to enforce, right? This is something you can do in the rules. Wazuh has by default predefined some standards, but you can add your own groups that represent the standards. Say you're working with GDPR or something like that. You can match that. And then this is another rule that says if the authentication failed, but this failed 3 times in the last 120 seconds, this is a level 10 alert, right? We're raising the alert level. This is a brute force. Somebody's trying to brute force a login into MidPoint. I guess that this is for testing the frequency, but that's the idea, right? And you have a higher level of alert, and you can match all the information that you have on a MidPoint event. MidPoint will give you the object that is changing, the type, who's changing it, the object ID. So there's a lot of data you can use to create your own rules. And so when we go to the dashboard and go to threat hunting events, there will be, for instance, authentication. We have examples of authentication failed, right, for a user, and the authentication failed after 3 times. A higher level alert is triggered, right? And you can see the details for that create session. So this is very, very powerful. And there's a lot you can do with this. We have a set of sample rules that you can use, but I guess that you can improve on that. So this is one of the aspects you can use Wazuh and MidPoint for. The other one is the configuration assessment. Whenever you install a MidPoint server, how do you know if that is right? If you have the proper setup in your system, if you don't miss something, right? And so with Wazuh, you can define configuration assessment policies. So let me go back to Wazuh. Let's go to one of the endpoints we have. This is our MidPoint server, right? So we have the configuration assessment section for that endpoint particular. And we can see that we have two policies in configure for this endpoint. One is the Ubuntu Linux 22 benchmark, right? This is coming with Wazuh out of the box. And then you have another one, which is system audit for MidPoint running systems. This is the one we created. So this is coming with the Wazuh standard. This is one we created specifically for MidPoint, and it's configured for this type of endpoint. The idea behind this policy is that they run a set of tests, right? You have a test. In this case, we have 49 passed tests and 79 failed for Ubuntu. And you can see these tests. If you click any of the tests, what you have is the rationale, what the test is trying to verify. If this failed, how can you resolve the condition, and a description. And then you have the command that was used to check the condition, right? These policies basically are running commands and checking things on your system automatically. And then you have all the standards, security standards that this check is enforcing, right, for you. It may be the case that not all checks apply to your system. Maybe you can ignore some things. You can tailor this to your needs. It's not like you need 100% safety, but it's good to know that your Ubuntu Linux is properly configured, even if you run MidPoint or not. That's a good benchmark. But then we created a MidPoint specific policy. It has a single check for this example, but it says ensure MidPoint configuration file is read only by the user, right? This is a classic check that you can do in MidPoint servers, the user permission, but maybe you want to check permissions on other files, on other folders. Maybe you want to check for some package to be installed. Maybe you want to check for the Java version you're running, something like that, right? So you can add more checks. And the way you define these files in Wazuh is like this, right? It's a YAML file where you specify the policy and the checks you will have. We have a single check, you can add more. And at some point you have this rule. And this is basically a sort of scripting language where you will configure, for instance, we are saying that the file stats for config should be 0600, which in Linux, Unix, this is read-only by the owner. And this is the only access we want. But you can add more commands and more stuff. So that's another very interesting tool, very useful to ensure that your MidPoint server is properly configured in your organization. Whenever you can improve on this, and every time you start, or maybe you run a patch on your server, you update it, you can check for the system configuration security, right? In the same line of ensuring that the environment is secure, we have the file integrity monitoring module in Wazuh. What this is doing is basically it monitors files in your system where the Wazuh agent is running. You can verify that critical files are not changed. If they change, you might want to do something, take some action. And the way you do that is by, when in Wazuh you define a group. You remember we can have these groups defined for endpoints, right? For instance, in our example, have a Linux group. So this will apply our rules or configurations for all our Linux servers, but then we have a MidPoint group. And the MidPoint group has only one agent, but it will basically provide configuration for that group, right? And if we look at the configuration of the agent, it's part of the Linux and MidPoint group. This is good because you can mix policies. Maybe you have a Linux policy that is for all your Linux servers, but then you have MidPoint policies that will improve on that. And there is one that is integrity monitoring. It's enabled, and what's being monitored, you have the standard Linux folders, right? But then we have MidPoint specific folders. We want to see if something is changed in these folders. For instance, the MidPoint key store. We don't want that file to change. If some of these changes, this will trigger an alert. Just like the log injection can trigger an alert, this is also some sort of log event that the agent will generate, and it will trigger an alert for you, and you can check that event. We don't want anything on the connectors folder to change, right? Maybe somebody's injecting a jar there, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that the MidPoint binaries are not changed. So you can set all this configuration. This is also something you can do in MidPoint in a file. You have when you define the group, right? There is a syscheck, and you can do this in real time. So as soon as the file changes, you get a notification. There is no performance hit with this because the agent is hooked to the OS, the operating system events. So the operating system will notify up for the change. It's not like where the agent is pulling on the files, right? And you can put a list of files there that you want to check, right? And you can get more complex things here, like, as I said, changing the alert level and stuff like that. But that will give you alerts about a file change. For example, let's go to the agent, right? And let me go back to the agent, and we can take a look at the agent we're running, and we see the recent events on the theme. We changed the config file, and if you want to see what happened here, you have the hashes. There's a way for you to get the deltas, but I wouldn't use a delta store if you are monitoring files that have a password, because the password might be part of the delta and you get the password exposed on an alert or somewhere else. So depending on what you're monitoring, you may or may not want to enable that Wazuh shows you what changed, right? You can also say, but we have a SHA. So we have the old SHAs and the new SHAs, and you can see that what was the previous hash value for that file. So this is also very powerful because you are sure that your MidPoint installation is secure. And now we get to the active response part. This is interesting. This is part of the integration. The idea is that you can configure Wazuh to take action when some specific rule or condition it's triggered, right? Let's say you identify some suspicious activity, and this activity can be outside of MidPoint. Maybe somebody is doing something in the accounting system. Maybe somebody's trying to access the internet-facing application, and Wazuh is monitoring those resources, and it says, okay, this is wrong. This is an alert, right? I'm raising an alert. Somebody's trying to brute force a login in here. So you need to react, and you can use Wazuh to tell MidPoint that something needs to be done, because Wazuh will be very good on identifying that something is wrong, but then MidPoint is very good on saying, okay, what is it that you want to change? Maybe I want to enable two-factor authentication for a user for a couple of hours, or maybe I want to take some privilege for an account because I want to say, this is weird. I don't want to block the user, but I want to restrict some accesses. So MidPoint knows how to do that. So Wazuh will tell MidPoint, okay, we need to do something and trigger a response for the user. And the way we do that is with Python. Let me show you in the code. We can have a configuration in Wazuh that says, this is the integrations configuration in Wazuh. And basically what you say is, if a rule was triggered, and you can put the rule ID, and there are other ways, but this is a common one, then run the custom MidPoint script, right? This is a script installed in the Wazuh server, and this is a rule we created for failed logins, right? Let's take a look at the rule. This is a rule that triggers when somebody logins incorrectly 3 times in our example, but it could be whatever you want. And if we look at the Python script, right, that we have, this is doing, when Wazuh calls your integration, it will give all the alert information to your script. It will create a temporary file that you can read. Basically, that's what we're doing here. And we're reading an alert file, right, which is JSON formatted, so you can read in any language. And from the alert, we are extracting data. And in this case, let me show you that's down here. So we are getting the alert from the temporary file. We get the alert level, the rule ID, just for logging purposes. But then we can get the principal, right? This is coming from in this case, from MidPoint. This is one of the attributes that MidPoint is doing. When you are trying to authenticate, MidPoint will give you the principal that is trying to authenticate. So what we do is we use Wazuh to get the user object, the user ID, because in Wazuh you need the OID to make changes to objects. So there is a call to the client, the API client, saying, okay, for this username, is there a user ID? And if there is a user ID, because maybe the principal doesn't exist, then we will modify the user and we will set the administrative status to disable, right, in our script. But you can do whatever you want. You have the entire MidPoint API. I would suggest you don't configure the password as part of your script. This is part of a sample process. But it's very powerful. You can run a task in MidPoint, right? Maybe you change the status of the user, and then you trigger a synchronization task for that user on all your resources, because you want, that MidPoint has, it's not like you change a user and that will be automatically propagated to other resources. It may or may not, depending on your configuration, but you can create tasks, you can run, create objects. There's a lot you can do automatically. And that's really one of the most interesting use cases. Because it's not only that, you can also, there are other tools in your SOC, all right, other than Wazuh. We are talking about Wazuh in particular, but then you probably have other tools. And sometimes you want a security analyst to trigger an activity. Maybe it's not like you don't want to do that automatically with MidPoint, but somebody will see that alert. It will say somebody's doing something weird in this system. He can take a look at the principal name. He knows the principal and say, okay, for this principal, I want to manually trigger that. And in your security team, you will have a tool that has a responder, which is a way of taking action upon a threat. He can trigger that responder, so you can go back to MidPoint and do the disabling for that account, right? So yes, I guess that is a very interesting use cases. All the resources for this are available. I know we're almost out of time, but we wanted to have some questions. We have the MidPoint config for you, the rules, the coders, the policies, the Python script, so you can take a look at them. We'll share with you that, right? And I guess that's what we wanted to show.